that he have floor privileges.
Without objection.
Madam President, I've been pretty outspoken in the last several weeks, actually, on the $700 billion bailout. I still think that historians will look back someday and say that that was the most outrageous vote that's ever been taken. First of all, it's the largest single vote of expenditure in the history of this country. Secondly, it was done with a well, let me ask your unanimous consent that I be recognized as if in morning business for such time as I shall.
Without objection.
To make it worse, it was giving an unelected bureaucrat the total power, usurping our powers of making all decisions over $700 billion with no oversight whatsoever. It's never been done before. It's unprecedented in American history. And nobody seems to care. It's just mind-boggling to me to know that this is happening and has happened, and now it looks like we're going to be voting in the other body as well as here on a motion that would be hostile toward that whole idea, but it's not going to pass. I mean, the money's going to be there anyway, and the reason is if the legislation that it will be coming before the House and the Senate is passed, still it could be vetoed by the president, and it would be vetoed by the president. And so all of a sudden he's going to have the second half of the $700 billion, the $350 billion laid at his doorstep to do with as he wishes. And I wouldn't want that for a Republican president or for a Democrat president, for any president. It's not the way we're supposed to be operating here. I think it's a fait accompli. I don't see any way a resolution of disapproval is going to be effective because, as I said, it could pass. I think it's going to pass the House, and very likely it could pass here, but I'm inclined to think it will not. Whatever the case is, it will become a reality. And I think that's bad for so many reasons. It's a precedent. People look at large numbers, and it's difficult for the American people and for me to really appreciate how much money is $700 billion. So what I normally do when we deal with large numbers, I'll take the total number of families in America that file tax returns, and I do the math, and this turns out $5,000 a family. Now, when I say it in those terms, which I've done quite a bit of talk radio and shows on this to kind of a wake-up call to the American people, then people do understand. And then I would say this, I've been a little critical of my own president, President Bush, because he's let this happen. This wasn't a Democrat idea or a Republican idea. It was the President of the United States in concert with the Democrats making this happen. And it all happened, this vote took place on October 10th, and ever since October 10th, I've had legislation that I've tried to get through saying that no, it's not going to be automatic. The accessing the second $350 billion should not be automatic, and so we had legislation to keep it from being automatic until 2 nights ago, when President Bush agreed to what I call a wish list by our new president when he comes into power. So it's going to happen. And again, this is unprecedented in American history. It's never happened before. And I have been very critical of our Secretary of Treasury, Paulson, for telling us what he was going to do with this money and then turning around and not doing it. He did not tell us the truth, and it's very disingenuous. Nonetheless, it's something that looks like it's going to be happening, and it looks like it's going to happen this week. And when you, in the defense of President Bush, if you take the total amount of deficits of the 8 years of his presidency from his own budget, and you add them up and divide by 8, it averages $247 billion a year. Now, you compare that with what we're faced with right now, and the new administration has said it's going to be somewhere between $1.2 and $1.8 trillion. So I hope, and I think people will look at this and say that the Bush legacy is not going to be one of the deficits, because it is nothing compared to the deficits that we're projecting now for the coming year as proposed by the incoming president, President Obama. Now, the reason I mention that is because I've even somewhat accused the President Bush of kind of looking for a legacy. And it occurs to me that George W. Bush has a legacy that may be unlike any other president in history. And I call this the invisible legacy of President George W. Bush. And the reason I say this is because, and I'm going to explain in detail how I come to this conclusion, but President Bush inherited a weaker America in terms militarily. And all of a sudden, after he got in, we had of course, 9/11 occur. So let's go back in history and see when George W. Bush was inaugurated in 2001, he was already behind the power curve when it came to the war on terror. As the 9/11 Commission confirmed, the United States was not on a wartime footing with al-Qaeda, even though they were at war with us. While our country took its peace dividend, our enemies continued to train, plot, and test. And you say peace dividend, it was a peace dividend. There's euphoric attitude that the Cold War is over, we don't need to have a military anymore, and that's what we were living with at the time. So the international terrorism took the forefront as bin Laden began his war against freedom and specifically against the United States of America. Afghanistan was used as a training ground for terrorists, and the Taliban regime allowed al-Qaeda unfettered mobility. They took advantage of this in major attacks. Look what happened. Look what happened back in the 90s. People don't pay any attention to this, and this kind of is a predicate as to leading up to 9/11, the tragedy, the worst tragedy in the history of America. On February 26, 1993, a car bomb was planted in the underground parking lot garage below the World Trade Center. This is the first World Trade Center attack. On June 25th, 1996, the Khobar Towers, we all remember that very well, they were bombed by Hezbollah with intelligence pointing to support by al-Qaeda. So that was 1996. We knew al-Qaeda was on the run at that time. We knew that they were building. They're increasing their sophistication in their attacks and their terrorist attacks. Now, August 7th, 1998, we recall what happened in Tanzania and Kenya, in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. Our embassies were bombed. Again, links were at that time established with al-Qaeda. In October of 2000, the suicide bombers used a boat attack on the USS Cole while it was moored in Yemen. This was it was one that we all remember well, and we remember how it happened, and we know the terrorist links that took place at that time. The United States response was at best inconsistent. Operation Infinite Reach included cruise missile strikes against Afghanistan and Sudan, but there was no real change. The inadequate response has been cited as a factor in emboldening the al-Qaeda's will to undertake more ambitious plans. That was simply kind of small. They had bigger plans. We know that now. In Operation Restore Hope, we became entangled in Somalia. We remember that very well, about the naked bodies being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, and America finally woke up, but we didn't do anything. We just kind of let it happen. And we directed all forces to stop all actions against Deed, except for those required for self-defense. Well, that's not a very good message, not a consistent message with our behavior in the past. So we withdrew from the country shortly thereafter. We also failed to remain vigilant to the Chinese. Security at our national labs was deliberately destroyed. We did away with, and this happened in the first few weeks of the Clinton-Gore administration. They went through the labs, the energy labs, and they stopped the wiretapping, and they stopped the background checks that they were conducting at the time. They even stopped color-coded badges, saying it was demeaning for some people to have a color of a badge that was less, that was on a lower scale than somebody else. So that's what happened, and of course we know the results of that. In 1995, we discovered that China had stolen our W-88 warhead plans. That was the crown jewel of our nuclear program, capable of attacking 10 nuclear missiles in a single warhead. But they had it, they got it. They got it because of a lack of security. That was the policy of that administration at the time, and I was critical at that time. We remember Bernard Schwartz of the Loral Space and Communications. They were given a green light to improve the precision of China's satellites and nuclear missiles. To refresh our memories, I remember it very well, it required the president signing a waiver, a special waiver, so that the Chinese missile program would have greater accuracy, and that happened during the 90s. China also gained the capability of accurately reaching the United States, continental United States, with missiles and targeting between 13 and 18 U.S. cities. And I was critical of President Clinton proclaiming at that time, he said, quote, not one missile is pointed at American children, when in fact, missiles were pointed at American children. That was happening during the 90s. Simultaneously, weapons of mass destruction proliferation throughout the world reached an unprecedented level. The Chinese government learned that it could rely on our acquiescence. They transferred prohibited weapon technology to North Korea, to Pakistan, to Iran, Iraq, Syria, and other countries, threatening to absorb Taiwan and intimidated our regional treaty allies, South Korea and Japan. The vast Soviet Union nuclear stockpile became fair game for entrepreneurs, with over 40 kilograms of Russian origin uranium plutonium being seized in 1991. Then we remember the Qadir Khan, the father of the Pakistan's nuclear program, began an international network of clandestine nuclear proliferation to Libya, Iran, and North Korea. North Korea withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty on March 12, 1993, and refused to allow inspectors to its nuclear sites. In Libya, further continued weapons of mass destruction research as a priority. Now, despite the increase in terrorist activities around the world and the growing signs of a direct threat to this country, we essentially broke our intelligence community through the lack of funding, inadequate number of linguists, and no interagency cooperation. I got to say this: my predecessor to this job was former Senator David Boren. David Boren's very talented young son, Dan, is now serving in the House of Representatives. But when I was in the House and I came to the Senate in 1994, I took his seat. He, at that time, was chairman of the Intelligence Committee of the United States Senate. And he made this statement to me. He called me up and he said, Inhofe, I want you to try to do something that I failed to do during the time that I was chairman of the Intelligence Committee of the Senate. He said, we have all these agencies, the FBI, the NSA, all the defense intelligence agencies, none of them talk to each other. And I found out later on that that was so true. And he said, you've got to get this done. That has to be a high priority. And I told him it would be. And we were not able to really do anything until George W. Bush came on. Now, if this wasn't enough, with the demise of the Soviet Union, our military was essentially neutered to counter a perceived diminished world threat. I remember so well this euphoric attitude that everybody had. The Cold War is over. We don't need a military anymore. And the Clinton-Gore administration cut defense budget by 40%, reducing it to its lowest percentage of GNP since prior to World War II. And as a result, President Bush inherited a force half the size of the military in 1990. Now, as our forces decreased in size and capability, deployments and deployment times increased. We've all seen the results. We have now 15-month deployments. There used to be 9-month deployments. We have these because he inherited this military that was undersized for the threat that we were facing. I have a chart here that I will show as documentation of this during the Clinton years. And I don't say this to denigrate the administration. I'm just saying we've got to understand how we got in the position that we're in today and that we've been in since 9/11. If you would take the black line here, this is during the Clinton administration. If he had taken the budget, the military budget, as it was at that time, and just had the increase for inflation, it would have been this black line going up. Instead, the red line shows what his budget request was. And if you take the difference between the red line and the black line, that's $412 billion reduced from when he took office. And that's how we got into this position. We downgraded our military, and a lot of people really believed that the threat wasn't there anymore because the Cold War was over, not looking at the new asymmetric threats, which are much greater. You know, I sometimes look back wistfully at the Cold War. Things were predictable back then. We knew what the Soviets were going to do at that time, the Soviets, not the Russians. And we knew what their capabilities were. These were known things, known behavioral patterns, totally different than what we have today. So the programs and equipment replacement costs were literally kicked down the road and left waiting in the wings. This happened to our modernization program. It happened in many areas, and this has been very demoralizing to most of us who believe that we have to keep America in a position with a strong national defense. We saw countries coming up with better systems than we have. We have, for example, the artillery piece, the best one that we have today, now that we are modernizing it now, but we didn't at that time, was called the Paladin. That's World War II technology. You have to get out and swab the breech after every shot. I mean, there are 5 countries at that time, including South Africa, that made a better piece than we had, and we're still using this today. And it wasn't until a very courageous General John Jumper, came up and admitted in 1998 that the best strike vehicles that we had, the F-15 and the F-16, were not as good as some of the SU series being developed in Russia and actually were being sold to the Chinese. We know of one sale where they bought 240 Su-30 type of vehicles. Again, better than anything that we had. So that was where we were back before George W. Bush was elected. Now, enter President George W. Bush. Starting with his first budget submission after inauguration, he proposed increases in defense spending and focused his Pentagon team on reform. He started with recognizing and revitalizing the military for the post-Cold War world it now faced. He provided the military with the funding required to develop force structure and modernize the aging force. So he's getting in there and starting to do something about the modernization program. Then, of course, 9/11 happened. Well, 9/11, we all know about that. We know what a tragedy, the most significant attack on America in our history. And it came at a time when we had a downsized military, downsized by about 40%. And so he was saddled with trying to respond to this, and he did. He asked Congress for new authorities and began to implement sweeping changes in our national security policy. The new policy declared, in this new policy, he declared a war on terror. And this is what he said. I'm going to read the quote back at that time. He said, "We will direct every resource at our command, every means of diplomacy, every tool of intelligence, every instrument of law enforcement, every financial influence, and every necessary weapon of war to the disruption and to the defeat of the global terror network." That's what he said at that time. And then he outlined the country's strategy. He said, first, we're determined to prevent the attacks of terrorism networks before they occur, unlike it was in 9/11. Second, we are determined to deny weapons of mass destruction to outlaw regimes and to their terrorist allies who would use them. Third, we're determined to deny radical groups the support and sanctuary of outlaw regimes. And fourth, we're determined to deny militants control of any nation. And he did. He asked Congress for the Patriot Act. Just listen to the things that he did. The Patriot Act to break down walls between government agencies. That's getting back to what David Boren observed many years ago, back in 1994, that had to be done. In October of 2001, he initiated Operation Enduring Freedom to dismantle the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which is harboring al-Qaeda. Bombing runs and Tomahawk missiles were launched. October of 2001, President Bush established the Office of Homeland Security. He tried to coordinate. This is the coordinating effort that offsets that corrects the problem that was called to my attention in 1994. So everything would be coordinated and everyone would know what everyone is supposed to be doing. The 9/11 Commission was formed and began implementing its recommendations, including intelligence reform, which included establishing the Director of National Intelligence. There you have it. That's the key. One director over all intelligence, military intelligence, domestic intelligence, and it worked. On March of 2003, President Bush launched Operation Iraqi Freedom, a preemptive attacks against Saddam Hussein, a gathering threat to the United States, who was reportedly developing ties with our enemies who openly praised the 9/11 attacks. I remember that very well because in the first Gulf War, which we should have gone ahead and taken care of Saddam Hussein at that time, we didn't do it, and there are some reasons that it couldn't be done. I happened to be privileged to be on with 9 other people on the first Freedom flight that went into Kuwait after the war was over. Now, it was so close to the time that the first Persian Gulf War was over that they're still burning off the fields, and a lot of them, the Iraqis, didn't know that the war was over, the ones that were in there. And I remember so well. One of the parties that was going over was the ambassador from Kuwait to the United States, and his daughter, I think she's around 7 years old. And what they wanted to do is go back and see what was left in Kuwait of their mansion on the Persian Gulf. And then we got back there, and I remember going by to see their mansion, only to find out that Saddam Hussein had used this for one of his headquarters. I took the little girl up to her bedroom. She wanted to see her little animals and all that, to find out it had been used as a torture chamber with body parts stuck to the walls and around there. This is what we were looking at that time. Well, Bush established the National Counterterrorism Center to assist in analyzing and integrating foreign and domestic intelligence acquired from all U.S. government departments. So, and again, putting this all together, he established the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office in the Department of Homeland Security to provide a single federal organization to develop and deploy nuclear detection systems to thwart importation of illegal nuclear or radiological materials. In order to consolidate terrorist watch lists and provide around-the-clock operational support for federal and other governmental law enforcement personnel across the country and around the world, Bush created the Terrorist Screening Center to ensure that government investigators, screeners, and agents are working with the same unified, comprehensive set of information about terrorists. He transformed the FBI. He strengthened the Transportation Security Administration through screening and prevention. He improved border screening. All these things he did in a very short period of time. It had to be done. It had never been done before. He expanded the shipping security through container security initiatives. He had the Project BioShield to address the chemical and biological, radiological, or that type of attack, potential attack against this country. Finally, he aggressively cracked down on terrorist financing with many international partners. Over 400 individuals and entities have been designated pursuant to executive order, resulting in nearly $150 million in frozen assets and millions more blocked in transit or seized at the borders. President Bush also rallied international support to fight terrorism with a coalition of more than 90 countries. We didn't do this alone. He brought in neighboring countries, other countries with the same problems that we had and the same exposure. This coalition of nations has actively worked to synchronize diplomatic intelligence, law enforcement, economic and financial and military power to attack terrorism globally. And one man did this. This was George W. Bush. The result of all these efforts is what I refer to as the Bush invisible legacy. Now, why is this an invisible legacy? I'm going to show you the things that were out there that could very well have happened to the United States of America, and some would have happened. But since they didn't happen, that legacy is invisible because they never happened. But that, to me, is going to go down as one of the great legacies of any president in the history of the United States. There's not been another attack on this country since 9/11. And don't think this was due to a lack of effort on the part of terrorists. In fact, there have been many attempts. I'm going to give you a partial list, Madam President, of the attacks that were stopped as a result of all these policies and programs that I just outlined that our president, current president, George W. Bush, was accountable for. First, December of '01. This is the first post-9/11 plot that was thwarted. It was a capture of an al-Qaeda operative named Ali Salah al-Mari in the United States, and was targeting water reservoirs and the New York Stock Exchange at that time. And also he was targeting and had his programs outlined in documents that we found through all these efforts to attack our various military academies. And he offered himself as a martyr to the Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And of course, we know he was the mastermind of 9/11. Anyway, all this was planned, but the Bush policies, I believe, stopped the attacks. And I have to say at this point, Madam President, that I served as on the Intelligence Committee. I served for a number of years, ever since 1994, on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And so I've been involved in these issues. And we know that this had a lot to do with stopping some of these potential attacks. Remember Jose Padilla? He's the guy that had the dirty bomb plot, an American citizen accused of seeking radioactive laced dirty bombs to use an attack against America. He was caught, he was convicted in August of '07. Again, this was a Bush program that brought him down. The 2002 aviation plots. Al-Qaeda leader in Southeastern Asia, it was Humbali, recruited several other operatives of Asian origin, and the plot derailed in early 2002 with international cooperation. The Library Tower is the tallest building west of the Mississippi. It was among 25 tallest buildings in the world, and this was one that was attacked. There is a written program how to bring this building down, and our policies, the Bush policies primarily, stopped that from taking place. In September of '02, the Lackawanna 6, we all remember that. The FBI thwarted the locally recruited terrorist cell, the Lackawanna 6, by the capturing of Jumad Dorsey in Afghanistan and subsequent interrogation while imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay. By the way, I disagree with the current attitude toward what's going to happen in Guantanamo Bay. I've had occasion to be there, probably more than any other member, and I can remember so well early on. Those who were in prison, incarcerated in Guantanamo Bay, actually had better treatment, better living quarters, better health attention than our own troops did at that time. And I think it's going to be imperative that whoever wants to close that down say, where are all these people going to go? 6 American citizens of Yemeni origin convicted of supporting al-Qaeda after attending a jihadist camp in Pakistan. 5 of the 6 were from the Lackawanna, New York. And anyway, the 6 were arrested and convicted. They're out now. They're terrorist attacks. They were very specific, are gone. And I think the new Bush programs at that time were primarily responsible for that. In May of '03, the Brooklyn Bridge plot. This was an American citizen named Ayman Ferris. He was charged with plotting to use blowtorches to collapse the Brooklyn Bridge. After being introduced to al-Qaeda operatives, New York and federal authorities intercepted a plan to collapse the Brooklyn Bridge by cutting suspension cables, as well as potentially derailing a train en route to Washington, D.C. He was arrested, brought to justice, and it was successfully stopped. June of 2003. In Virginia, a jihad network that was taking place. 11 men from Alexandria, Virginia, just south of here, trained for jihad against American soldiers, convicted of violating the Neutrality Act conspiracy. 11 Muslim men were charged in the U.S. District Court in Alexandria with training with and fighting the group that was associated with al-Qaeda. Several members of the group were found to have trained for future attacks by using paintball facilities in the Northern Virginia area. It was stopped. And the Bush policies were primarily responsible for giving us the resources to stop attacks like those I'm outlining. August of '04, the financial centers plot. This was the Indian-born leader of terror cell plotted bombings on the financial centers. His name was Barrow. He plotted a memorable Black Day of Terror via a dirty bomb that targeted financial institutions in New York, Washington, D.C., and in Newark. Barrow was arrested at his home in Pakistan with the cooperation of others. But again, these were the Bush policies, the resources that we used to make this happen. August of 2004, the same month, the Penn Station plot. And this was a James L. Schaefer and two accomplices sought to plant a bomb at New York's Penn Station near Madison Square Garden during the Republican National Convention. The New York City Police Department's Intelligence Division helped to conduct an investigation leading to their arrest. Again, using the policies that we had President Bush had put in place. Same month, the Pakistani diplomat assassination plot. We all remember that two leaders of the Albany, New York mosque, Yassim and Aref Mohammed Hassin, were charged with plotting to purchase a shoulder-fired grenade launcher to assassinate a Pakistani diplomat. An investigation took place, the FBI, all of these coordinating under the single leadership of the new system that had been put in place. They stopped it. And with the help of an informant, the perpetrators of that plot have been brought to justice. And again, that was stopped. August of 2005, Orange County, California, terror plot. There's 7 people were involved and were arrested in Los Angeles and charged with conspiracy to attack Los Angeles National Guard facilities and synagogues. Several synagogues. It was all down. The plan was there. It's in writing. We can look at it. We know that was going to happen. Kevin James allegedly founded a radical Islamic prison group and converted LeVar Washington and others to the group, which was known as the JIS. After Washington and Patterson were arrested for robberies, and police and federal agents began a terrorist investigation when the search of Washington apartments revealed a suspicious target list. Well, we had a list of targets in Orange County that were going to be brought down. Again, these policies weren't available to us before the Bush administration, and we were able to stop that. December 2005, the gas line plot. Michael Reynolds was arrested by the FBI in December of 2005 and charged with being involved in a plot to blow up a Wyoming natural gas refinery, the Transcontinental Pipeline. That's a natural gas pipeline that goes from the Gulf Coast to the East Coast and into New Jersey. And it's, I believe, owned by the New Jersey Standard Oil Refinery. The Reynolds was convicted for providing material supporting terrorists and soliciting a crime of violence and all of this. And again, we used the new resources that were available because of our President George W. Bush. April of 2006, the U.S. Capitol and World Bank plot. Saeed Alman and another one whose name was Ehsanul Islam, from Atlanta, Georgia, were accused of conspiracy, having discussed terrorist targets with alleged terrorist organizations. They met with Islamic extremists and received training and instruction on how to gather videotape surveillance of potential targets in the Washington area. Their targets happened to be the U.S. Capitol, right here, where we're standing today, and the World Bank headquarters. And they were the targets, and again, we were able to intercept this and to bring them to justice, and these new policies that were put in place by our current president were, in my opinion, responsible for that. We had Narcel Batiste, and he had 6 others that were involved in the Sears Tower plot. They were arrested in Miami and Atlanta in June of 2006 for being in the early stages of a plot to blow up the Sears Tower in Chicago, as well as FBI at several other buildings. The arrests resulted from an investigation involving an FBI informant and all the rest of them working together with the new resources that they had, and they were brought to justice. Again, this was the new system that we had in place. New York City, the train tunnel plot. This is a frightening thing to think this could have happened. There are 8 suspects, including Asim Hammoud and an al-Qaeda loyalist living in Lebanon. They were arrested for plotting to bomb the New York City train tunnels. He was a self-proclaimed operative for al-Qaeda. He admitted that he was with al-Qaeda when we brought him to justice, and he admitted to the plot. He is currently in custody in Lebanon, and his case is pending. 2 other suspects are in custody in other locations. But the bottom line is, it didn't happen. It was precluded from happening as a result of the new resources that were put in place in the coordination of all of our intelligence committees. March of '07, the skyscraper plot. This was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's mastermind. He was the mastermind of 9/11 and the author of numerous other plots confessed in court. People think of him as only 9/11, but he also had plans in writing to destroy skyscrapers in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, and also plotted the assassination of both Bill Clinton and Pope John II. Again, that was stopped. May of '07, the Fort Dix plot. This was another one. I won't go into details on this, but this is one where the Fort Dix Six were thought to be leaderless. We found that they were a homegrown cell of immigrants from Jordan, Turkey, and Yugoslavia, and they had ties to Al-Qaeda. They were stopped. The plot was stopped. They were brought to justice. And this, I believe, was due to the new programs that were put together by the Bush administration. June of '07, the JFK plot. Suspects plan to hit fuel farms and a 40-mile aviation fuel supply pipeline. Specifically, they're targeting the symbolism of JFK, seeking to invoke an emotional reaction, saying it's like killing the man twice. We all remember that. We know what happened. We know that we were able to stop it. Again, perhaps that would not have been done. I think the bottom line here has been that there hasn't been another successful attack on this country since 9/11. And it didn't just happen. What this administration has accomplished in the last 5 years is phenomenal. In the aftermath of 9/11, he brought us together as a nation, prevented our enemies from striking again, and captured many who would have tried. President Bush awoke the nation so that we could begin to deal aggressively with the threats that were facing us. Because of President Bush, we no longer treat terrorists like common criminals, but as enemy combatants. We no longer turn a blind eye to nuclear proliferation by negotiating without the real threat of military action. We fully funded a readiness challenge, Cold War equipped and organized military who had suffered from a decade of no modernization. We have removed threatened regimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, freeing 50 million people. We have weakened the Al-Qaeda network and its affiliates. We have disrupted terrorist plots and built a coalition of more than 90 nations to fight terrorism, and we have transformed our approach to combating terrorism after 9/11 attacks. So you can ask the question, would all of these terrorist attacks been successful? Obviously, no. But I honestly believe, and it's my judgment, that in having the background and the years, serving on the Armed Services Committee and the Intelligence Committee, that some of these, to me, it's not conceivable that none of these would have occurred. And I really believe that this invisible legacy, let's keep in mind, it's an invisible legacy of George W. Bush because they didn't happen. If they didn't happen, they're invisible. But nonetheless, they were stopped. So the bottom line is this: the New York Stock Exchange was not bombed. The military academies were not bombed. Liberty Tower was not bombed. Brooklyn Bridge was not bombed. New York and D.C. financial centers were not bombed. The Penn Station was not bombed. Los Angeles synagogues were not bombed. New Jersey Standard Oil refineries were not bombed. The Transcontinental Pipeline was not bombed. The World Bank was not bombed. The Chicago Sears Tower was not bombed. New York City train tunnels were not bombed. JFK Airport was not bombed. And our nation's Capitol building was not bombed. Now, clearly, the Bush invisible legacy may go down in history as perhaps the greatest legacy of any president. And I know that people don't like to give credit where credit's due. This was something that took almost all of his energies at a time when otherwise it was something could very well have happened. It's my honest judgment that if it had not been for his changes in our intelligence process, that one or more of these terrorist attacks would have been successful. I believe that in my heart. I think history will treat that as the case. So clearly the Bush invisible legacy may go down as the greatest legacy in history. Now, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that an Oklahoman editorial January 13th of '09, and that the Heritage Foundation backgrounder number 2085 be included in the record at the conclusion of my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. With that, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call a roll.
Mr. Akaka.